All right, let's start with Chapter 6, Part 2 of Chapter 6 from Lincoln, How Abraham Lincoln Ended Slavery in America by Harold, every day I do that, right? Harold Holzer. The peace convention failed, but Lincoln knew that Congress too hoped to enact a compromise before he could take office as president. He sent specific instructions to Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois that he would not welcome this effort. Stand firm, he ordered Trumbull. The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter. To another member of Congress, he urged similar courage. Hold fast as with a chain of steel. But just hours before his inauguration, Congress actually passed a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, but not the 13th Amendment that stands there today. This one instead promised the very opposite, that slavery would be allowed to survive in the South forever without any further challenge. Lincoln did nothing to stop the original 13th Amendment from passing because he believed it had no chance of being ratified by three-fourths of the states and becoming the law of the land. Ironically, one of his first duties as president became the unpleasant task of sending this initial 13th Amendment to all of the nation's governors for their due consideration. It must have pained him to do so, but for a new president in a time of crisis, it was critically important to perform all the duties the law required, however distasteful. Lincoln was right. The amendment was never ratified. Lincoln's last task before taking office was to finalize his presidential cabinet. No mean feat, considering the large egos he wanted to bring into his administration. Lincoln hoped to balance his cabinet with Northerners and Southerners, ex-Whigs and ex-Democrats, for the Republican Party were a new party composed of former members of the other two. Typical of presidents of his time, he also wanted to reward the big states that voted for him, particularly New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Some even whispered that Lincoln's convention managers had promised delegates from those states cabinet appointments for their favorite sons in return for switching to Lincoln. The problems in creating such a team of rivals, as historian Doris Kearns Goodwin had called it, became evident as soon as Lincoln began doling out the plum jobs. He convinced Missouri's Edward Bates, and Maryland's Montgomery Blair to serve, but decided he could trust no other politician from the South. They might quit the cabinet should their states secede. Then there were the personal issues dividing these aspiring politicians. New York's William Seward refused to serve in the cabinet if Ohio's Salmon Chase joined too. Chase would not join the cabinet if Seward did, and neither man would agree to be part of the administration if Lincoln offered a job to Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania, whom many politicians suspected of being corrupt. Corrupt means they do things that are shady and against the law, so they didn't want to work with a corrupt person, or at least someone they thought was corrupt. Remarkably, Lincoln convinced every one of them to enter his cabinet, personal and political differences notwithstanding. Seward became Secretary of State, Chase Secretary of the Treasury, Cameron Secretary of War, Blair Postmaster General, Bates Attorney General, and Caleb B. Smith of Indiana Secretary of the Interior. When friends in Illinois complained that Lincoln had failed to include a secretary from his own home state, he merely drawled that Illinois needed no representation because Illinois had the president. On March 4th, 1861, Lincoln rose before sunup and dressed himself in a new black suit he had purchased in Chicago. He rehearsed his inaugural address one more time by reading it aloud to his son Robert, and then walked downstairs, climbed into outgoing President James Buchanan's horse-drawn carriage, and joined a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Willard Hotel to the U.S. Capitol. Hey, a little known fact, the president who was leaving office, James Buchanan, is the only president from Pennsylvania. I think he's the only president from Pennsylvania. He's the only president that wasn't married, I'm sure of that. And his house is here in Lancaster. In one sense, the huge procession must have filled spectators with confidence. Thousands of Lincolnites lined the streets to cheer, one newspaper reported. Beautifully decorated floats rolled by, and thousands of veterans from former wars marched proudly behind them, waving. But onlookers could also see how many guards rode close to Lincoln's carriage to protect him from potential danger, and how many sharpshooters stood on nearby rooftops, rifles raised, ready to fire at anyone who caused a disturbance. It seemed more like escorting a prisoner to his doom than a president to his inauguration, one observer lamented. Lincoln arrived in the Capitol to find 5,000 people gathered in the plaza outside to hear him deliver his much-anticipated address. From where he stood, he could see the site of the old boarding house where he and Mary had lived when he served in Congress years before, to such little notice. Now, as the nation's new president, he would reveal to all the American people what he intended to do about secession. Secession, remember, is when states decide to leave the United States of America. They say they're not part of us. Would he let the South leave the Union without a fight, or was he prepared to use force to compel them to return? Lincoln unfolded his thick manuscript, put on his reading glasses, and began reading the speech that everyone had been waiting for. And onlooker remembered, I never listened to a speaker whose enunciation was so clear and distinct. You not only heard every word that he uttered, but every sentence was most clearly expressed. I believe his voice was perfectly audible to every one of those people who occupied the acres before and around him. The words themselves were powerful. Physically speaking, he insisted that day, we cannot separate. Secession would not be tolerated. The Union must remain intact. Lincoln was willing to make some concessions after all. He promised to enforce the much-hated Fugitive Savage Act, infuriating abolitionists, and he repeated his vow that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. But above all, he pleaded with the South to reconsider its rush to leave the Union. Lincoln left no doubt that he planned to use all his powers as president to enforce the law and reunite the states. He would insist that the mail continue to be delivered in the South. He would require that all federal forts and arsenals in Southern territory remain the property of the U.S. government, and he made it clear that it was up to the South to choose between conflict and peace. As he declared in words clearly directed at unhappy Southerners, in your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. You have no earth registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I think we'll stop there for today. That's the second part of chapter